Michael Howe, and as President of RUSI New South Wales, I'd like to welcome you to the September RUSI New South Wales lecture, which will be delivered by Vice Admiral Tim Barrett. I'd firstly like to acknowledge our First Nations people, the custodians of the land, which if we're watching this in Australia anywhere, and also acknowledge our tribal elders past, present and future. On behalf of all of us, I'd particularly like to thank any First Nation person who is serving currently in the ADF. This month we're continuing our lecture series on improving resilience, and I'd like to invite someone to introduce our guest speaker who is particularly apposite for this role, and that's Commodore Mike Flynn, Royal Australian Navy, retired. Mike is our Senior Vice President. He has a very distinguished career in naval medicine and is also a qualified naval aviator. It's therefore with great pleasure that I would invite Mike, as our Senior Vice President, to introduce Admiral Barrett, our speaker for September. Thank you. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Michael. Colleagues from the Royal United Service Institute for Defence and Strategic Studies, New South Wales. Following on from our President, Michael Howe, welcome to this, our September lecture in the series of Resilience in the Australian Defence Force. The fact that we are undertaking this presentation today via Zoom is a potent reminder of the highly unusual circumstances in which we find ourselves. Major changes in the geopolitical and world economic outlook, all in the midst of a global pandemic, the genesis of which remains to be seen. Australia is an island continent and is heavily reliant for its survival as a nation on the security of our trade routes. The government has recently announced the most far-reaching changes to our defence posture that have occurred, at least in my lifetime. Who better to provide an analysis of one of the most important features of our resilience, preparedness, our sovereign shipping fleet, than the former Chief of Navy from 2014 to 2018, Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, CSC AO RAN retired. Tim's CV is extensive, and it would be difficult to cover all of this in the time allotted to me this afternoon in the manner in which it deserves. Tim joined the Navy in 1976, and after graduation from RANC and HMAS Watson, specialising as an aviation warfare officer in the executive branch, he subsequently dual qualified as a Fleet Air Arm Observer, now called Air Weapons System Officer. He holds bachelor degrees in Arts and Politics, a Master of Defence Studies from the University of New South Wales, and has completed the Advanced Management Program at Harvard Business School. He has held a number of operational commands, both ashore and afloat, and served on exchange with the Royal Navy. His commands include Border Force and the Australian Fleet. He was awarded the Conspicuous Service Cross in 2006 for his leadership and development of the Australian Naval Aviation Group, otherwise known as the Fleet Air Arm. He was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2009 for his role as Border Force Commander, and subsequently elevated in status to the officer in the Order in 2014. There are 70 speeches made by Tim during his tenure as Chief of Navy available online. He is the author of a seminal book on naval strategy published in 2017, and which you will see illustrated in his talk today. He eloquently argues the case for the Navy to be seen as a national enterprise. I commend it to you. As with the other service chiefs, his was an onerous weight to bear. During his watch, there were major developments in the RAN, both operationally. Fleet units have been on station in the Persian Gulf continuously since 1990, and with the introduction of major new assets, such as the two landing helicopter dock 27,500 tonne ships, Adelaide and Canberra. Tim was the 24th of a long list of distinguished sailors who have held this important post, commencing with Rear Admiral William Creswell in 1913. He now advises on a broad range of maritime issues to government and to industry, and sits on a number of related boards. Sea blindness is a term often used to describe an island nation's antipathy towards its maritime environment. Vice Admiral Barrett will discuss the state of our maritime industry in relationship with the Navy and efforts to rebuild this capability. Admiral Barrett, over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Members of the Institute, it's great to be with you. Can I start by thanking Michael for his introduction, but also for his invite for me to be able to talk to you today. It's been a momentous couple of days, and I'm sure some of you thought that the ex-Chief of Navy was here to talk about nuclear submarines. Sadly, that is not the case. That's a conversation for another day. But I would like to applaud the Institute for this theme series on resilience. I think it's a really important topic, and I've enjoyed listening to previous speakers. But I often find that resilience is spoken about during or after a crisis has occurred, be it a pandemic or be it a bushfire. I find it equally important that we sit down on occasion in the cold hard light of day to discuss our preparations for the next crisis. I hope that today's conversation on resilience in Australia's maritime industry contributes to that theme. Is it important? Well, I think it is. It may affect your health today, or the car you drive tomorrow, or indeed whether you'll have fuel to be able to drive the car tomorrow. We celebrate the fact that we're a maritime nation. We even have a national anthem that displays the virtues of being girt by sea. But I would argue that if you speak to the average Australian, they have very little concept of where maritime trade fits into the prosperity of this nation. Few would understand that about 90% of our goods by volume come by sea, 60% by value, or that about 98% of our telecommunications pass by undersea cable and not by satellite. And yet over a protracted period, we have slowly reduced the size of our maritime fleet, our civil maritime fleet, from over 85 vessels to now about 13 vessels, with a prospect that we'll have only 9 in a few more years' time. Is that important? What does this really mean to our future prosperity? Some would already argue that we have a high standard of living. And also, if you read the recent Productivity Commission report on supply chain vulnerabilities in Australia, you would conclude that we're doing okay. But I have to ask the case, is this just a case of sea blindness? What do I mean by that term? Well, it's something that navies have been used for quite some time to show how little a nation might understand the purpose and need for maritime trade or its navy. Many of us in the Navy grew up with the readings of Alfred T. Mahan. He said, quite poignantly, that commercial value cannot be separated from the military in sea strategy. For the greatest interest of the sea is commerce. He was right. More recently, another admiral in the US Naval War College Journal wrote that sea blindness was that being the result of a public and political lack of understanding of the role of the maritime industry plays in the strategic and economic health of the nation. So I thought I'd take the opportunity today to raise the awareness of Australia's maritime industry, to consider whether it is resilient at this stage and whether we're ready for the next crisis. Let me declare my interests up front. Since leaving the Navy, I joined the board of Maritime Industry Australia Limited, which is a company that represents the interests of maritime industry within Australia. But during my 42 years within the Navy, I saw the profound effect and relationship between civil and military maritime interests and realised there has always been a connection between the two, but it is not heavily understood. I now find that in this role I can promote the effects of the civil industry. I'd like to start by putting some context around the discussion. We have to consider the fundamentals of the contemporary trade practices and how the maritime industry is affected by those practices. So let's talk a little bit about trade itself. You've heard the word globalisation. That is the characterisation of how our industry works today. It's for the good of the nation. It's about freer trade practices. It's about more goods for more people, at less cost and in less time to market. It leads to prosperity, higher standards of living, and all of those are good goals. In this current year, this current decade, it's driven by technology. Everything from ship design, port infrastructure, freight management systems, tracking systems, and combine that with improved supply chain management ashore, reduced inventory, lean management, and all those sorts of things, and you get a just-in-time capability. but there are consequences. We've seen in Australia a lot of manufacturing move offshore to low-cost labour-sourced areas. We've seen a dismantling of sovereign capability, and we've seen a higher intra-shipping dependency, which introduces more points of disruption. All of this leads to a greater reliance on an efficient maritime industry. But the focus has always been on economic security, not on national security, and it's very good when there's no crisis or no conflict. So what do we mean by an efficient maritime industry, and what might it look like? Well, there are several industry components that we need to consider. The first, most obviously, are ships. But it's not just the operation of ships. It's about shipbuilding and a national repair capacity. It's about owners and the agencies that run those. It's about the operating fleet itself and its domestic or international components. It's about ports, their locations to market, their technology that they employ, their status, are they free or open ports? It's about the associated agencies, the financiers, the brokers, the insurance operators, and those that conduct maritime research and development. You also need appropriate government regulation and legislation. And there are two important terms to note here. One is the flag register of ships that belong to a certain country or operated by that country, and cabotage, which is a way in which a domestic operator can dictate who calls at what ports under what flag. And the last one is workforce. That involves mariners, engineers, shipbuilders, etc. Importantly, it's a demonstration of the sustainability, the education systems in place to allow you to continue to run a workforce at the right level to manage the rest of your industry. Critically, there's a balance across all these components. There's a difference in application across maritime nations, and we'll talk about that in a few examples later on. But success requires an alignment between each of these. What I ask you to think about, though, is if you are successful in all of these areas, and you do that by a cohesive plan to bring all of those into their most effective means, then you're looking at driving a trading monopoly, and that's an important note that we'll come to later on. Now, there are some geostrategic effects on maritime trade which we must note. An important consideration is the historic view of global commons as the basis for trade. It's where international law prevails on the high seas. It implores principles like the freedom of navigation and of freedom to use trade routes. But it's important to note that there are some important choke points that lie within the areas where Australia and its major trading partners operate. Another consideration are the disruptors to maritime trade. It could be as simple as an accident, most evident most recently with the Ever Given in the Suez Canal. The effect of closing the canal had about $7 billion per day lost trade. The second point, which relates to also choke points and trade routes, is territorial disputes or ownership of areas where someone may seek to change the nature of how people can pass through those straits. And the last one is piracy, still prevalent in certain parts of the world, both in Somalia, Southeast Asia, and around West Africa. The consequence of all these things, the geostrategic effects, is the need to reroute major trading lines, which rises costs, insurance costs, fuel costs. It's not new, but it challenges the lean trading concept and tests resilience. And it introduces the notion that disruption is as bad as destruction when you seek to influence maritime trade. Let's now look at Australia's trading position to see how our maritime industry has to adapt to the needs of the nation. Our top 10 two-way trading partners are China, US, Japan, South Korea, UK, Singapore, New Zealand, India, Germany, and Malaysia. China, by far the greatest, but principally all the nations we trade with are in Asia or Pacific. Our top 5 export market is China, but again mainly to Asian markets. But note that Australia is the 22nd ranked export market within the world, whilst China is number 1. Our top exports are minerals and fuels and rural and manufactured goods. If we look at the import market, again, the top 5 includes China, US, Japan, Germany and Thailand, but again, predominance around the Asia-Pacific area. And again, Australia rates at 23rd as an import market, but China again is second in rank. The top imports over the area are intermediates and consumption of capital. These are all bulky items. These are predominantly delivered by sea and to the Asia-Pacific destinations. The other thing to note is our dependency on China. That's no surprise. But it's more so of us on them than them on us. But there are further considerations for trade that we need to look at. Of all of those things that are traded, there are critical items for our own national resilience, goods that affect productivity or indeed our own survival. For example, fuel. About 90% of our fuel is imported, mainly through Singapore. 98% of our transport fuel is imported from overseas. The International Energy Agency Convention demands that developed nations hold about 90 days capacity. You may recall that in 2015, at one point, it was alleged that Australia only had 12 days' supply of diesel. The government response was to consider, under a fuel security program, a need to look at strategic holdings in the US and to use ships at sea to carry that. Has the consequences of this really been considered when, as we will see in the later part of our conversation, most of our tankers are owned under a foreign flag? The same issues arise with pharmaceuticals and ag products. Before we determine Australia's current state of the maritime industry and its effect on its own resilience, let's look at how 4 other maritime nations balance these industry components and judge their effect. We'll start with Norway, which has been a long-standing maritime trading nation. It's only a small land area of 340,000 square kilometres, a population of only 5.4 million. It has an inhospitable land area, but resource-rich in the maritime environment. In fact, it has the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, mainly from offshore oil, but is strong in fishing as well. It has a dramatic coastline, which has spawned over a long period of time a strong domestic coastal trade. It's an innovative nation. Already they are looking at autonomous e-ships to deliver trade in coastal routes between fjords. It's adaptive to the market, particularly where fuel prices have changed over a period of time. Consequently, within Norway, shipping is considered as an industry in itself. Indeed, in 2014, it accounted for 6.7% of GDP. So it's not just an enabler. One thing that is evident is that all associated elements of the industry that we discussed earlier are aligned under a government strategic plan supported in legislation. It's called the Maritime Cluster, and it includes shipping agencies, ship owners, merchant fleet, ports, government regulation, the lot. The Norwegian fleet at one stage was the 3rd largest in the world by capacity. It has over 1,700 vessels in 2 flagged arrangements. It's the 19th largest shipbuilding economy in the world and deals with both military and commercial in joint ventures. Over 110,000 people are employed in the industry. There is significant correlation between the operating fleet and this shipbuilding capacity, but what we can see from here is a successfully integrated maritime industry and likely to be resilient in the face of future problems. Let's now turn to the UK. On one stage, Britannia really did rule the waves. It has an economy long supported by maritime trade and an industry supported in legislation. There is an enduring relationship between the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy, which was most recently demonstrated to effect in the conflict during the Falklands War in 1982. I was on exchange with the Royal Navy at the time, and I saw the effect of the harmonisation of the Merchant Marine and the Royal Navy. Over 40 commercial vessels were in the programme for ships taken up from trade, or stuffed. There were liners, ro-ros, container and cargo ships, freighters, tankers, support vessels and tugs. All were under the UK flag, at a time where the UK had over 1,000 suitable ocean-going ships to be able to call upon. Legislation was required. It's noted that legislation can only requisite your own flags. All that said, the zenith of the UK maritime industry has passed. It was the world's biggest shipbuilder until the 1950s, but the UK flagship tally has now declined significantly to less than 500 ships. The sector these days accounts for only about 0.06% of GDP. But significantly though, Britain hasn't imposed cabotage since the 19th century, but government involvement is still quite profound. Recent government maritime strategies will be used to free market mechanisms to attract industry, tax benefits for UK flag registration, a tonnage tax will ease costs and increase training commitments, a government-endorsed maritime shipbuilding strategy for commercial and military vessels. So whilst it's past its heyday, it retains a strong intent for an integrated maritime industry in a post-Brexit economy. Now let's move on to the US. As the world's largest economy and trading nation over the past 70 years or so, the US maritime industry has been predominant but not dominant in the arena. While more liberal maritime trade practices were enshrined in other maritime nations like the UK, the US continues to be characterised by what is known as the Jones Act of 1920, which balances sovereign resilience, national security with economic security. Simply put, the Jones Act says that for domestic maritime industry, port to port within the US waters, including inland waterways, there is a legislative requirement that all ships are built in the US, that the crews are US citizens, and that the ships themselves are US owned. It was created to generate a domestic seafaring capability, including shipbuilding and repair, both commercial and military, a US flag fleet, which would be available to the military, and a competent workforce across the whole enterprise. It was a deliberate and disciplined strategy. It simplified customs and border controls. Commercial security was assumed through consequential international flagged fleet and freight shipping dedicated at entry points. Has it worked? To a point, there remains a thriving domestic maritime trade. More recent views of the Jones Act point towards an emphasis on national security. The Department of Homeland Security says without Jones, oversight of the foreign ships arriving in the US would be difficult to manage. The United States Navy continues to say that it's needed to ensure that strategic sea lift capability and Navy shipbuilding can survive. The Department of Defense says maintaining a US flag fleet is in the national interest, and they support the US shipbuilding to maintain capability for commercial vessels. The effect, when considered from a national security lens, is obvious. The US forward deployed policy is paramount. About 95% of military equipment is moved by sea. To support that, about 70% of the domestic maritime industry is available to support the military in this quest. And the domestic capability is significant. US flag ships, about 30% of all container and 90% of all tankers are suitable for use with the military. But there are some serious detractors of the Jones Act who sought to repeal it in 2020. It was seen as protectionism rather than globalisation, and these were all economic arguments. However, further legislation is now being pursued, including the Tanker Security Program under the American Shipbuilding Act, which seeks to impose a percentage of exports all carried by US ships. Now, despite the strong correlation of legislation and significant shipbuilding under these arrangements, shipbuilding has actually declined in the US over the last 30 years. At the time of the Cold War, there were 20 major shipyards for major ship construction still operating. Now there are 8, 4 for commercial use, 4 for military use. By way of example, in 2019, China had 1,291 ocean-going ships under construction, and the US had 8. So it's probably about time we spoke about China. It is wrong to focus solely on the size of China's commercial or military fleet when considering their maritime industry capability. The rise of China's capability has been guided by 2 thoughts. Unlike other emerging economies after the Second World War, which relied heavily on foreign shipping services, China adopted a policy of building up its domestic commercial fleet to meet the continuing demands of international trade. It was rather like the intent of the Jones Act in the US. But it's been noted that the Chinese economy is not a free market. It is a state-managed economy with an industrial policy. When it identifies a strategic sector, it uses a whole-of-government approach to build them up. Thus, China has embarked on a global maritime trade path, which ties all elements of the maritime industry components that we discussed earlier in a deliberate and disciplined strategy to achieve a foreign interest goal. In terms of ships, the number of yards has grown in recent years to over 2,000, a mix of civilian and military. There has been consolidation between major companies to improve efficiencies, and the arrangements are managed under a single ship management office. In terms of ports, domestic ports and ports associated with the Belt and Road Initiative around the world have been modernised and are now technology rich and managed under single consolidated management through CMS. Associated agencies have also improved. 3 of the top 10 financial and brokerage institutions for shipping in the world are now Chinese, and it is assumed that control through mortgage over new shipping will be another path that the Chinese will seek to take. In legislation, the whole of government strategy across 50 years of development, with overt plans to become the world's biggest shipbuilder and trader, are now evident. And from a workforce perspective, over 400,000 shipbuilding staff now available across 2,000 shipyards within domestic China. And there are over 115,000 students in various nautical academies as mariners, engineers, and conducting research and development. The results are quite staggering. As a shipbuilding nation, China now accounts for about 40% of the new build commercial ships within the world. In the previous decade, it has also constructed over 90 warships. There are more than 5,500 merchant ships engaged in international trade. 20% of all containers carried by the top 10 carriers are Chinese. 2/3 of the world's top 50 container ports are managed by Chinese concerns, and they manage about 70% of the world's shipping containers. It is reported they are now numerically larger than the US Navy in ship numbers, and with a Coast Guard of 150 modern cutters and a maritime militia estimated at about 2,000 vessels. So I ask you to recall the 2 notions that were proposed earlier on in our discussion of the industry at large, and that is the creation of a trading monopoly and a view that the ability to disrupt rather than destroy is a capable trading path. Clearly, China is in a position to conduct both at this stage. So having looked at how others do it, let's actually look now at how Australia's industry compares. As a large nation with only a small population, we do indeed operate a global shipping network. Locally, the sector includes domestic cargo, offshore oil and gas, support, aquaculture, tourism and fishing. In 2018, the estimated annual revenue generated by the maritime industry was about $6.9 billion, which added approximately $2.3 billion to the economy. About 10% of the world's sea trade passed through Australian ports, the busiest ports being Port Hedland, supporting the iron ore trade between Australia and China. But if we look deeper into the various components, in terms of shipping, there has been a persistent decline in Australian flagged ships over the past 50 years. As said earlier, from 85 in the early 1980s to 13 at present, and a possible 9 in 2024. The predominance of foreign flagged ships can be attributed to 2 things: the high costs of Australian operations and reforms in the Shipping Act to allow foreign operators to conduct coastal trade, i.e. there's no cabotage within Australia in the coastal trade. In terms of shipbuilding, there has been a persistent decline in commercial shipbuilding yards, due mainly to high production costs. The 2 outlying yards here are Austal and Incat, which still provide successful commercial operations. Smaller yards are now for leisure craft only. It's important to note that the last coastal trader that was built and flagged in Australia was built in China. In terms of military shipbuilding, it's a different story. With the Naval Continuous Shipbuilding Plan, the government has invested a vast sum of money to produce ships for the military in a continuous program. There are 2 major yards, one in Osborne, one in Henderson. In terms of ports, there's a fairly disparate management of ports, mainly state-based, with consideration of foreign ownership of some companies in Darwin and in Newcastle. In terms of government legislation, there have been significant reforms to acts over the last few years, reducing Australian ownership, increasing foreign flagged vessels, and consideration of disparate tax measures at corporate and seafarers' tax levels. One thing of note, there is no significant maritime cluster or a significant cohesive strategy. In associated agencies, there are suitable structures to manage the high level of foreign ownership, but little engagement of ship financing for domestic markets. In terms of workforce, a recent skills study done by the Maritime Industry Australia Limited pointed to diminishing numbers and a lack of recognition of the relationship between mariner skills and industrial skills needed to manage ports and the industry itself. In summary, the Australian maritime industry is characterised by a number of factors. The industry is led by market forces and is fairly reactive. It's focused on economic security with legislative support. There is little focus on national security implications in terms of fuel security or other key critical trades. This has led to several peak bodies promoting a strategic fleet, skills management and regulatory changes. The biggest consideration is no cohesive overall plan. And as a consequence, the risks to resilience are growing. In conclusion, the evidence would suggest that China is on the rise to being the dominant global maritime trading nation and may well already be there. It encompasses a cohesive, deliberate and disciplined coordination of all components of the maritime industry into a single national outcome. The benefits could be trade monopoly and the ability to dominate the market forces in today's globalised trading regime. Whilst all other trading nations will feel the heat, those with some retained elements of the sovereign maritime industry that we've discussed earlier will be able to manage resilience better than most. However, Australia's maritime industry position on resilience is mixed. The naval shipbuilding plan will generate a modest sovereign capability. Exports and imports will necessitate ongoing industry performance, and ports will continue to operate. But increasing foreign ownership of the international fleet, combined with a loss of sovereign manufacturing capability, will raise the risk of our resilience to crisis, be it pandemic, trade monopoly, or conflict. Our examples have shown that a cohesive, government-led maritime strategy with aligned regulation and policy and enduring oversight of the industry as a whole is required. These can mitigate some of the extent of the risks in the future. But sadly, sea blindness remains a national characteristic. Thank you.
A pleasure and privilege to be able to thank Admiral Tim Barrett for that compelling and wide-ranging presentation on resilience through maritime policy. You, perhaps like me, were struck by the enormous range of examples, analyses and facts that Tim reviewed for us, and I'd like to perhaps encourage you to understand that we will, we hope, convert Tim's presentation into a journal article for our RUSI Journal United Service, and please look out for that. And it may well be that, like me, you were just finding it difficult to react to the many very compelling points that Tim made. But I'd like to make just a couple of big ideas that struck me at least. Firstly, that the announcement of the nuclear propulsion submarines of just this last week or so has led us to an acceptance by Australia that the global order has changed very significantly, and this could be an excellent opportunity for the Australia of today, as distinct from the very recent Australia, to listen more thoughtfully to the type of analysis that Tim has presented. I found that his case study of 4 different countries, Norway, United Kingdom, United States, China, was very instructive and pointed out that you do not necessarily have to be a very large population country to have what Tim phrased as national resilience as distinct from economic-driven resilience. I thought that these ideas are exceptionally compelling, very strongly worth discussing, and give value to relatively more independent places like RUSI, ASPI, LOE, as places where people can raise issues which are not necessarily about government current ADF policy, but nevertheless are very important discussions to hold. On behalf of RUSI and all of its members, I'd like to thank Tim for his leadership of the Navy, his 42 years of service. I have personal experience of the massive transformational role that Tim provided as Chief of Navy, to which and from which we're all about to benefit. Closing this September webcast, I'd like to take this opportunity of just briefly outlining our remaining programs for particularly October and November. Hopefully we're coming out of the complete COVID isolation lockdown, and we're optimistic that our October lecture can be face-to-face in the Anzac Auditorium. But could I advise everyone that if it is, COVID restrictions will mean places will be very limited and will almost certainly be restricted to double vaccinated people wishing to come. And we'll organise a booking service so that you can make those bookings. Could I draw your attention to our speaker in October? Will be Commander Andrew Howe, the Commanding Officer of HMAS Sydney, giving us an update on the Aegis weapon systems that are being widely introduced across the Australian Navy, and particularly in the Hobart class destroyers. Our big event in November is our major seminar, and although it's not published yet, I'd like to just show you a preview of some of the photos of the speakers. The Governor will open the seminar. We have Admiral Hammond, Major General Pearce, Air Vice Marshal Ovasi, Major General Tomei, the New South Wales Defence Advocate, Air Vice Marshal Kim Osley, the CEO of Thales Australia New Zealand, Mr Chris Jenkins, and the Vice Chancellor of the University of Newcastle and the previous DSTO Chief Scientist, Professor Alex Zielinski. It will be an event not to be missed, but places will be exceptionally limited, so please keep an eye on our website and our future material. Again, I'd like to thank you for watching the September webcast and give our particular thanks to Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, the recently retired Chief of Navy, for such a valuable and a compelling address. Thank you very much.